Yeah, should I just try that out?
Why don't you do that really quickly just to, exactly.
Yeah. Great. Kristen, you tell me when.
Welcome, everybody. Good evening. The Museum of American Finance is the only finance museum in our country with a core mission of preserving, exhibiting, and teaching about our nation's finances and financial history. Welcome, everybody. We are a 501c3 Museum of American Finance, a Smithsonian affiliate, and I'm David Cowan, president of the museum. And we are joined tonight by thousands of you who are live streaming over our YouTube channel. This is our second partnership with Bloomberg for Education. We want to thank Rob Langrick and Blair Wilkie of Bloomberg for making this all possible. Now, there are cards at your seat for questions, so please fill those out, and we will collect them during the lecture. But I have a question for you now, and that is, what do the following individuals have in common? Immanuel Kant, Bart Simpson, Steph Curry, Kanye West, and Jeff Koons. And the answer is that they all appear in Professor Mihir Desai's book, The Wisdom of Finance, which will be on sale afterwards, and he would be happy to autograph a copy for you if you were so inclined to purchase it. Now, this is a unique book about finance because he uses individuals and stories to explain finance, not equations, not Microsoft spreadsheets or Excel spreadsheets, and not graphs. And we at the museum really understand that. We often use stories and individuals to explain finance because we understand what an intimidating topic it can be. Professor Desai is an award-winning teacher at both Harvard Business and Law School. He's a dual degree graduate from Harvard with an MBA and a PhD. He was a Fulbright scholar. He has offered expert testimony to Congress on several occasions. He's written some 50 scholarly articles. He has 6 in the works currently, and this does not include his opinion pieces on the FT, or in the FT, in the Washington Post, and the New York Times. He's been teaching at Harvard since 1998. Now, this book is an outgrowth of a lecture, a very special lecture that the professor was asked to give to graduating Harvard Business School students before they went out into the workforce to impart some wisdom. And so tonight, we all get to be Harvard Business School graduates as we hear about the wisdom of finance. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Mihir Desai.
Thanks so much, David, and thanks to all of you for coming. It's a real pleasure to be here and a real pleasure to be able to present this book in this fantastic setting. I'm a big fan of what David and Kristen do, and I'm really delighted to be here. So let me just tell you what I'm hoping to do in the next maybe 30 minutes. I don't want to take up that much more time than that. I believe in Q&A, and so I would love to hear your questions along the way. So I'm going to try to keep this relatively quick. But I really wanted to give you a sampling of what the book is about, because I think it is a slightly different kind of book. While I was writing this book, I kept telling my publisher, you know, this is a really weird, idiosyncratic book. And he said, don't worry about it. Every author thinks that. And then I turned in the book, and he said, this is a really weird, idiosyncratic book. And I said, I've been trying to tell you this. So I'm delighted to try to give you a little peek of it. So let me just get started. I thought I would tell you first how this began. And as David referenced, this began as a little bit of a talk to graduating MBA students. So this is basically the way things worked, which is somebody asked me to give a talk to graduating students. I said, sure. I decided that I would give a talk about what was going on in the capital markets and share buybacks and all this stuff. And I was told that is not the idea. The idea is to impart some wisdom as they go out into the world. So I committed to a title, not knowing what it meant, which is often something that happens to me. You make a commitment without knowing fully what it means. I chose the wisdom of finance. But what happened next is more interesting, which is as I prepared for the talk, it was just surprisingly easy to map the big ideas of finance to ways to think about your life. And so as I did that, I just came to realize that finance, which is fundamentally about where value comes from, has that same question that we all have with us, which is, where does value come from in our lives and in the world? That's what finance is about, and I think that's what a lot of us care about. After that, it got a little more complicated, which is the correspondence between finance and life was clear. What was less clear was how to make it into a book. And for those of you who have been students, I'll just share this quick story with you. The reason this became a book is because I started giving it to 2 or 3 groups of students, and I got an email from one of them. So if you've ever been a student in a classroom, you should know how influential you are. The email said basically, it would be a crime if you didn't turn this into a book. Of course, I made the mistake of forwarding that to my wife, who cut that out and pasted it on my mirror. So I woke up every morning to that little email urging from one of my students. The question in turning it into a book was, yeah, that correspondence is great for a talk, but how do you make it into a book? And the answer was, you have to use stories. And so I'm an economist. I'm a pretty straight up economist. I write empirical papers and theory papers. And as an economist, we're taught to distrust stories because it's not data. And so I deeply distrusted stories. And what I came to discover in this process was how powerful stories are. In fact, one of the best experiences I had when writing this book was I cold emailed a writer at the New Yorker who I really, really liked. And for whatever reason, he wrote back. And I had maybe 5 5-hour lunches with the guy. His name is Joshua Rothman. And it was spectacular. And he made me remember what stories are about and why they're so important. So that's when the book came about. So what is the book basically about? So let me tell you what it's not about. If you're looking for some stock picking trips or when to roll over your IRA, this is not what this is about. So just to be clear, it has nothing like that. I'm not going to tell you to nudge yourself into saving more or anything like that. This is about something different. About 50 years ago, C.P. Snow, who's this remarkable chemist at Cambridge, he was also a novelist, he won the Booker Prize, he wrote a book called Two Cultures. And his point was that the science and the humanities have become divorced from each other. And it was a real tragedy for both sides. That same thing has happened to finance. People in finance often look down on the humanities and humanists often look down on finance. And that is a complete loss for both sides. So the goal of the book is to reunite that. And in fact, what I figured out is the humanities can actually illuminate finance in a really interesting and novel way. As David mentioned, no equations, no graphs, just stories. And it turns out the ideas of finance actually provide insight into how we live our lives. So the underlying idea here is we're going to try to humanize finance and demystify finance, and we're going to use the humanities to do that. So, and then the epigram I just wanted to mention is money is a kind of poetry, which is a Wallace Stevens quote. The reason I chose that as an epigram is, like the title, it combines 2 things that most people think of as being contradictions. So the title is Wisdom and Finance. Typically people will think of those things as not having anything to do with each other. Money and poetry similarly. The reason I chose Wallace Stevens' quote as well is, some of you may know, he's a fantastic poet from the 20th century, I think the greatest American poet of the 20th century. Here's what you may not know about him. He worked in insurance his whole life. He spent his entire career at the Hartford. And in fact, Harvard University tried to lure him to become the Charles Eliot Norton Professorship of Poetry. And he said no, because he wanted to stay at the Hartford. And the reason why is, in part, he understood that insurance is really not that different than poetry, and money is not that different than poetry. So he's a living example of this kind of synthesis. All right, let me give you a slightly grander version of it, and then we'll just dive in. If you don't know anything about finance, the whole idea is to get you in. People demonize finance today, often because they don't understand it, and they're intimidated by it. By demystifying it in some ways, hopefully people will stop demonizing it for unnecessary reasons. The second piece is, I think if you're in finance, it gives you a totally different way to think about what you do, and hopefully a refreshing way to kind of triangulate around these things. And then the most aspirational part of the book is to say, effectively, parts of finance are broken. And what I mean by that is chunks of finance have more to do with value extraction than with value creation. And we have to face up to that 10 years post-financial crisis. How do we make it better? there's two dominant ways. One is outrage, Occupy. It's not clear that will go very far. And the other alternative is regulation, which is fantastic potentially, but has some adverse consequences. And I don't think we should expect too much because a lot of regulators are captured themselves by the industry. So here's the underlying idea of the book, which is we are going to make finance aspirational. We're going to make people in finance look at what they do with a moral lens. When you're staring at spreadsheets and screens all day, you forget the moral content of your ideas. The idea in this book is to say there is moral content in finance. Don't act as if it's an area or a domain that's bereft of it. I think what's happening to finance today is we've demonized it. We expect very little of the people in it. As a consequence, they don't necessarily behave that well all the time. That's a really, really bad equilibrium. I want to turn it around and say we should be aspiring to better behavior. That is a better way to kind of move forward with the practice of finance. So hopefully we rehabilitate finance in the grandest version of the book. Okay, so let me just dive you into the book. This is going to, let me just say before I show this, this is going to sound worse than it is. What I tried to do in this slide is show you the kind of skeleton of the book, which is a way of saying how it's organized, but not literally what the chapters are about. So I'll just walk you through all of it at once. Sorry. So the outline of the book is effectively the big ideas of finance, all of them. In fact, it corresponds roughly to a textbook of finance and the biggest ideas in finance. Why is that? Because I wanted to actually show people the underlying structure of the ideas. As you might expect, we begin with the most important thing in the world, which is risk and insurance. One of the best things about writing this book is I had to revisit all these ideas and think hard about what they really meant. And risk is the core. I'll walk you through a little bit of that. Once you introduce risk and insurance, you got to think about risk management. The two primary tools we've developed in modern finance, options and diversification. From there, we go to the central question of finance, which is how do you create value? Where does value come from? And I'll give you a little bit on that as well. From there, we kind of move away from markets and start talking about how companies work. So arguably, the most important problem in capitalism today is the corporate governance problem. We appoint people to run companies, and then they sometimes misbehave. That turns out to be the central problem of finance. I'll walk you through why that is and how to think about your life with those tools. From there, we go to the cheekiest version of the book, which is mergers, talk about what we know about mergers and leverage, and then finally, bankruptcy. I'll walk you through a little bit on each of these ideas. The book concludes with my effort to make sense of why these great ideas that I just talked to you about don't stand in the way of people hating finance. So the title of the chapter is Why Everyone Hates Finance. Of course, that's an overstatement, especially for those of us in the room. But it's just trying to understand why finance has gone wrong, at least to a little bit. So that's roughly what the outline of the book is. These slides are really simple. There's not a lot of fancy PowerPoint. The only thing that it is a set of pictures. There are two things I'm particularly proud about the book. One is the references section, which may sound really nerdy, but you have to sacrifice a lot of scholarly instincts when you write a book like this. So I stuffed it all into the references section, and I'm really proud of that. That's a great guide to learning more if you're interested. And the other thing I'm proud of is every chapter begins with a picture. And I fought hard for this with my publisher, and I think that's all you're going to see here is the pictures. I thought we could have a little fun with the pictures. The first one is impossibly hard, but maybe we can play a little game, and you can tell me who these pictures are of after the first one. Okay? All right, fantastic. So as I mentioned, we begin with risk and insurance. So I'll just begin as I begin the book with a story. So some of you may be familiar with The Maltese Falcon, which is a Dashiell Hammett novel and film. Spectacular film, very, very young Humphrey Bogart as Sam Spade. Turns out John Huston in that movie left out the most important piece of that novel, which is something called the Flitcraft parable, which I'll just retell briefly. Most Hammett scholars think it's the most important kind of piece of the Hammett oeuvre. Here's roughly what's going on. Sam Spade is talking to his love interest slash prime suspect. They're often the same person, and in this case, they're the same person. He's talking to her and says, just breaks into a story. He says, you know, several years ago, I got a call from a woman who said, you know, my husband disappeared 5 years ago, out of thin air. And somebody just saw him in Spokane. So I want you to go up there and find him. See if it's true. So Spade goes up to Spokane. And very quickly, he finds the guy. The guy's name is Flitcraft, by the way. He quickly finds the guy, and he says, what happened? What are you doing? And by the way, his name changed to Pierce, Charles Pierce. So he says, what are you doing? And the guy says, look, here's what happened. I'll just tell you the truth. By the way, totally happily married, had a great job, nothing to hide. He says, I went out for lunch one day, and as I was walking to lunch, a beam, a big iron beam, fell on the sidewalk right next to me. And a piece of the sidewalk came up and hit me in the face. And in that moment, I realized that there is randomness everywhere. And I have been living my life as if there's actually order. And I'm now going to just completely disorder my life, and I'm just going to move away and start again. He's kind of really deeply impacted by randomness. He decides to do this. And so he went off for a little while, and then he ended up in Spokane. And then Spade says, my favorite part of that story is when he found him in Spokane, he basically recreated the same life he had in San Francisco. So what is that story about? What I think that story is about, actually, they're clues buried by Hammett. It's about risk and insurance. So Flitcraft was the most important actuary at the time. He developed actuarial tables. And Charles Pierce, actually is Charles Peirce, is a fantastic American philosopher who actually was obsessed with insurance. What Peirce and Hammett understand is that the fundamental human condition is randomness everywhere, and then how you deal with it. And how insurance company deals with it is by looking for patterns, by looking for the regularities. So just like Flitcraft saw randomness everywhere, and then he ended up exhibiting complete regularity with who he was, that is exactly what insurance is. And that's how insurance works. Just to drive this home, I'll tell you a brief story about Charles Peirce. If you haven't heard of Charles Peirce, and I assume most of you haven't, because he's a surprisingly obscure guy. He's the founder of American Pragmatism, the school of philosophy. He ran the first randomized controlled trial. He's the founder of semiotics. Incredible guy. He named the normal distribution. So it's around 1900. Peirce has been thrown out of the academic community because he had an affair. And the president of Harvard won't let him on campus. William James, who you might know is a philosopher, says, look, you got to come back and give a talk. We're going to rehabilitate you. He's living like hand to mouth, not doing very well. So Peirce says, great, I'll come and give a talk. William James sets up the talk, gets special dispensation to have this guy back on campus. And what does Peirce do? He stands up there and he starts giving a talk, and he says, we are all insurance companies. And then he says, he basically uses calculus on the board to derive the pricing conditions for optimal insurance. This does not go over well. People think he's crazy. People think he's drunk. William James disowns him, and he ends up basically destitute. The rehabilitation doesn't work. But what he understood is we are all insurance companies, because that became the foundation for pragmatism. What is the recipe in pragmatism? Go out and experience the world. That's how you live according to pragmatism. No introspection, get experience. That's the sense in which we are all insurance companies. Those are two stories in that chapter. I also go through the history of risk, why we were unable to understand risk for so long, and then how we came to overcorrect and think of it as all deterministic. Peirce was the guy who figured out that two things could be true at the same time. Everything's random, but there are patterns everywhere. It took us a long time to figure out that those two things could be true together. There's lots of little stories in here. My favorite is the one about the tontines. Some of you will be familiar with tontines, this remarkable instrument that is meant to insure you not against dying, but against living too long. The New York Stock Exchange was founded on the remains of the Tontine Coffee House, a coffee house built on tontines. I go through a little bit about that as an insurance idea and why it's so important. Just so this may be something you know already. At the turn of the last century, tontines were one of the most, if not the most important financial asset for Americans. They've disappeared now. I'll give you just a quick story about that, which is I go to French public finance in the 18th century to explain tontines. Turns out France tried to use tontines. Short version is we all get together, throw in $100, and then as we die, the amounts go to the remaining people. So if you live really long, you're able to live on income. You're insuring yourself against living too long. It turns out that they horribly mispriced them, which leads in part to the French Revolution. All right, so let me go to the second chapter. This time we'll play the game where you have to identify the picture, and we'll see how it goes. I have great confidence in you. It's a totally unfair game, by the way. There's no reason we're going to get this, but I have faith. Anybody want to say who that is? Very tough. 19th century author? English? Jane Austen, indeed. So risk management is fundamentally about, once you have all this risk, what do you do about it? So I try it with Pride and Prejudice. So if you think about Lizzie Bennet, who's the character there, all these characters in those novels, they have a risk management problem. Suitors come a-knocking. Some of them are drunks, some of them are rich, some of them are boring, and you got to figure out which one to actually take. And Austen makes it clear, being a man is not risky. You can make mistakes. But if you're a woman in that era, you can't make any mistakes. In fact, you might remember the worst proposal ever. Mr. Collins comes up to Lizzie Bennet and says, you know, you're not that pretty, you're not that smart, you better take my proposal that's on the table today. She says no. The next day, Charlotte says yes. He's playing on her risk aversion. So the reason I chose that is to embody the idea of risk management. But then what's really fun is her novels and the novels of Anthony Trollope show how the intuition of options and diversification actually were intuited that back then as a solution to this problem. So for example, Violet Effingham, who's this great character by Trollope, is faced with all these suitors, and what's her answer to it? She basically says, you know, if only I could marry all 10. You know, which is a way of saying the logic of diversification. Atomize your choice, spread it out over people, and that's how you manage the risk. She also basically gives rise to an option buying strategy. She basically says, I'll just accumulate a bunch of potential husbands, and then when I'm ready, I'll hit the bid, which is effectively a portfolio option strategy. All of this is meant to kind of give you a sense that, God, these derivatives that people think of as complicated, modern finance, people think of as complicated, it is a core idea in our humanity. Options transactions go back to the Greek philosophers. Diversification was in strip farming in the UK 700 years ago. These are all deeply human ideas. And I kind of walk through how those ideas have evolved. One thing I try to do here is caution against the way people in finance overinterpret these ideas. So if you know people in finance, many of them are obsessed with optionality. They talk about optionality all the time. Options are the right to do something, but not owning anything, right? So you get all the upside, and when the world moves against you, you're not really on the hook. So one of the things that I wrote as part of this was an opinion piece in the Crimson called The Trouble with Optionality. So what I see every day is kids who come into my office and who say, I want to go work at this prestigious firm, I want more education so I can get more optionality. What does that mean? I get more choices later. And I'm just going to buy optionality now so that I can go do what I really want to do. In fact, people in finance talk about optionality with everything. So marriage is the death of optionality. So the point that I try to make here is actually that's really deeply destructive. If you live your life buying optionality, what I observe is people just keep buying optionality their whole life. They never actually do the things they said they wanted to do. Because buying safety nets is so addictive and buying options is so addictive, you forget that what you're supposed to do is take the underlying risk. So I think that's one way in which these kind of correspond to life as well. All right, so we'll try one more. This is an even harder one, so I apologize again, but we'll just try it out, see how we do. It's really, really impossible. I feel bad even asking. I'll give you a clue. It's an engraving. It's a story. It's from the Bible. It's from the book of Matthew. It is not the day laborers. I talk about the day laborers parable. This is the parable of the talents. So I'll just tell you briefly this story, because it turns out to correspond to exactly the recipe in finance for value creation. Here's the parable of the talents. Talents today are special things that make us different, that we're good at. Of course, the origins of this was money. Talents was a unit of weight for money. What's the parable of the talents? The master is going off on a trip. He's supposed to be God. He calls his 3 servants in, and he says, I'm going to give you 5 talents. Take care of this, and when I come back, we'll talk. Here are 3 talents for the second guy, and then he gives a third guy 1 talent. He goes away. He comes back. The guy with the 5 talents goes back to him and says, "Sir, I took your 5 talents, and I went out, I lent it out, and I made it into 10 talents. Here, it's back for you." And the master says, effectively, enter the kingdom of God. The second guy says, "I took your 3 talents, I made them into 6. He says, welcome to the kingdom of God. The guy with 1 talent says, I was a little bit nervous, and I wasn't really sure, and I really wanted to give you your talent back, so I buried it, and it's right here, and I want to give it back to you." And what does the master do? Damns him and casts him out of the kingdom. It's a pretty weird parable. It's a very strange parable of punishment. But the reason I choose to talk about it is that is the recipe for value creation in finance. The underlying logic of value creation in finance is we are stewards of other people's capital. You have to exceed their expectations, call that your cost of capital, in order to actually create value. That is exactly what finance teaches. And in fact, John Wesley Mitchell, the founder of Methodism, took that parable and he made it into his creed, which is give more than you can for as long as you can, to as many as you can, in as many ways as you can. I think that's a pretty good summation of where we think value comes from in finance. You have to beat your cost of capital, you got to do it forever, and you have to kind of keep doing it and growing in order to really, really create value. That's what we teach in MBA classrooms every day. In this chapter, I also try to talk about the capital asset pricing model, which is a Nobel Prize winning idea. I won't give you the full intuitions, but for those of you who are familiar with these ideas of beta, it's kind of an important idea in modern finance. I just try to make clear that high beta assets, which are really risky assets, negative beta assets, which are actually really great assets, they bear a striking relationship to how you should think about friendships in your life, which I try to go through basically the CAPM and map it to how you think about relationships. All right, this one I'm hoping someone's going to get. I'm going to keep my fingers crossed. Let's see how we do. Again, unfair question. The producers! Thank you very much. That's Bialystock and Bloom from the producers. So, turns out, that's Zero Mostel and that's Gene Wilder from the 1968 film. Turns out the storyline of the producers is an elaboration of the central problem of capitalism. What's the storyline of the producers? These 2 guys raise a lot of money from a lot of unsuspecting investors. They raise way more money than they need. They sell 25,000% of a show. And then they go out about to create the worst show ever, because then the investors won't want their money back. No one will ever know that they raised too much. They make The Springtime for Hitler, terrible actors, terrible director, terrible everything. It becomes a smashing success and they go to jail. That's the short version. That basic problem of investors giving money to their agents is the fundamental problem of capitalism. It's a separation of ownership and control. 150 years ago, most of us had the privilege of working for ourselves. Merchants, farmers. What's the condition today? I own Apple stock. Do I get to tell Tim Cook how to do his rollout of the iPhone 10? No. I own, he controls. How do I get him to do the right thing? That is finance. That's what capital markets are all about, trying to get him to do the right thing. Think back to several years ago when there was a revolt at Apple. What ends up happening? David Einhorn, Carl Icahn, hedge fund managers start protesting. They stage a revolt at Apple. They say they're going to sue to get all that cash back. That's the principal agent problem. I just try to show in this chapter 2 things. One is, once you see the principal agent problem in capital markets, you'll see them everywhere. Because it's not just David Einhorn who is Tim Cook's principal. David Einhorn himself is the agent of the Canadian pension plan who's given him money. And in fact, the Canadian pension plan is themselves an agent of the Canadian pensioner who's given them money. In many ways, capitalism is a daisy chain of principal-agent problems. They're just everywhere. The reason I try to do this in the context of our lives is I try to show how that principal-agent problem is everywhere. So what is the principal-agent problem? Again, I have something to do, I delegate you to do it, and you have to go do it for me, right? You know, think about a doctor who you go to seek for advice. You think about a general contractor you get to build a home. That's the principal-agent problem. The reason I try to go through it is I think it maps to your life. Obviously to a work setting it maps, but it also maps to a personal setting. I'll share a story from my life. The hardest part about writing this book is there's some personal stories in here. I'll share one with you now that I think the principal agent problem really helps you think through. So it was several years after my father passed away. My mother had a woman living with her, but my sister and I were worried about her. She was spending way too much time by herself, and we were worried about depression. So my sister and I are talking, and all of a sudden, by the way, my sister and I live very close to each other. All of a sudden, we say to each other, of course, we'll move mom closer to us, and she'll be with the grandkids, she'll be with us, we'll break the solitude, it'll be fantastic. It's one of those ideas, as soon as you have it, you think to yourself, why didn't I come up with this like 5 years ago? I go talk to my mom. I say, Mom, we got a great idea. You're not gonna believe this. I say, we're gonna move you close to us. You'll be able to see the grandkids, you'll be able to see us all the time, it'll be fantastic. And she says, no. And I say, you don't understand, let me try it again. It's gonna be fantastic. And she just says no. And at that moment, I kind of came to realize that I thought I was serving as her agent, doing something for her, or maybe for my father, you know, taking care of her in a way. And then I realized that we had made her into an agent. We actually wanted her to be close to us. We didn't want to schlep over there. We wanted our kids to grow up with her. And so we made her into an agent, all in the name of being her agent. And I think that kind of confusion shows up in life all over the place. One final story I'll share with you, because Mel Brooks runs throughout this chapter. He was married to Anne Bancroft, who's an actress. Very successful marriage, like 30 years long. Here's the story. Anne Bancroft is an actress. She comes home one day, and she says, the director was horrible. I hate this thing I'm doing. The script is terrible, blah, blah, blah. And Mel Brooks says, you want to know what's hard? And he raises a blank piece of paper. That's hard. So what is that story about? So Anne Bancroft is an agent. That's hard. But if you want to know what's really hard, being a principal. Actually saying to the world what you want, as opposed to doing what the world wants you to do. All right, this one hopefully is something we can get. I don't know. It's again. Oh, sorry. This is a hard one. And this is not. I don't think. It's Van Eyck, and it's the Arnolfini portrait. This is the cheekiest chapter in the book. I'll just tell you about it briefly. It's called No Romance Without Finance, which is the name of a great Tiny Grimes song and a Little Feat song. It basically tries to make the point that romance and finance have been intertwined for millennia. I tell that story via the Dowry Fund. You know, it's just an incredible story of how Renaissance Florence was financed. It was financed with the Dowry Fund. You know, just briefly, the Dowry Fund is what? The Dowry Fund is the following. There are several problems in Renaissance Florence around 1420. One, dowry prices are going through the roof. Dowries are paid by fathers of brides to husbands, okay? Fathers are panicking. Why is the price of dowries going up? There are no men. Bubonic plague. Prices are just escalating. Second problem, the men aren't getting paid. So they're like getting married and then the dowry never shows up. Third problem, Renaissance Florence needs a lot of money to build itself and fight the other cities. What comes up? The Dowry Fund. Fathers of daughters give money when girls are 5 years old to the state. They get a nice high interest rate, protects them against dowry price inflation. And by the way, when the bond matures, it gets paid directly to the groom. So you solve that problem. This turns out to be like the largest financing tool in Renaissance Florence. The point of the story is romance and finance have been linked forever. In this case, I tell the story of mergers. There's a lot of folklore around mergers in finance. If you kind of go ask your investment banking friend, and what do we know about mergers? It turns out the folklore about mergers applies very nicely to marriages. And this is the cheekiest part of the book, but it actually is remarkably true. So what do we know about mergers? Many fail. arguably at least more than half. Why do they fail? Answer number one, synergies are always dramatically overestimated. Synergies are ways in which I'm going to change the acquiring company and squeeze a lot out of it by changing who they are. That doesn't really that doesn't work much in mergers, and it doesn't terribly much work in marriages. Integration planning is always underdone. Serial acquirers end up hollow shells. There's a set of parallels between, I think, mergers and marriages that kind of runs through this. All right, let me just show you two more pictures. This, hopefully if you focus on the guy on the right, and you focus on that little tower in the back, you might get this one. Thank you. It's Shylock and it's the Merchant of Venice. Exactly right. This, of course, is a famous Shakespeare play, and it's all about debt, right? Of course, it's not really all about debt. The scholars who have studied the Merchant of Venice know that it's really all about commitments, right? So Antonio makes a commitment to Shylock, Bassanio makes a commitment to Antonio, Portia makes a commitment to Antonio, Antonio makes a commitment to Portia, and it's about the web of commitments in our lives and what happens when we break them. That's what that play is really about. And of course, that's what debt is, a really, really significant commitment. In the chapter, I just try to show why it's a powerful way to think about your life. And I do that by contrasting low leverage companies or low leverage firms and high leverage firms. And instead of doing that in a normal way, I contrast George Orwell with Jeff Koons. So George Orwell is your classic zero leverage guy. It's the mid-1940s. He wants to write 1984. He's in London. Everybody wants something from him. He leaves. He goes to the Scottish Hebrides, and he just writes 1984 in 3 years, just all by himself. That's low leverage. No commitments to anything. Jeff Koons is the opposite. Jeff Koons is, I think, arguably, I think, the best American artist today. Creates these massive Play-Doh structures that are like half the size of this room. How does he do it? He employs 150 people. He doesn't actually work with the material at all. He doesn't even know how to work with the material. He calls himself the ideas man. He's gone bankrupt 3 times. He bankrupts dealers all the time. But he's created this remarkable body of art that he could never have done by himself. That's what commitments are, and that's why people in finance love leverage. Why is leverage so fantastic? You get to live in a house you have no right to live in. You get to an education you couldn't pay for otherwise. That's why people in finance love debt. You get to control assets you have no right to control. And that same thing is true in life with commitments. The largest sense is the Jeffersonian sense. The cover of the book has Archimedes with his famous quote, which is, give me a place to stand and a lever, and I will move the world. That's why people in finance love leverage, because we get to move the world. The Jeffersonian quote that I try to share at the end is, Jefferson says, quoting Archimedes, he says, I have always thought that the best thing to do in life is the right thing, because that is a way to get a good reputation. And your reputation is the best lever you can have if you want to move the world. Effectively saying good reputations are valuable because people will allow you to do things you have no right to do, which is effectively what reputations are and why they're so precious. This one is totally unfair. That's Daniel Defoe going bankrupt. And maybe I'll stop with this story, and maybe I'll just do a quick quiz here because I'm hoping the answer is nobody knows this. Does anybody know who Robert Morris is? Thank you very much. And somebody back there. So this guy is amazing. He was the wealthiest man in the colonies, known as the financier of the Revolution. His scrip personally finances the Battle of Yorktown. He is actually the first superintendent of the bank during the Articles of Confederation. George Washington asks him to be his first Treasury Secretary before he asks Hamilton. His name could be on the Richard Rodgers Theater, and nobody knows who Robert Morris is. Why is that? Well, he says no to Washington because he wants to rebuild his wealth. It's been depleted during the Revolutionary War. He goes on to rebuild his wealth. He ends up owning 40% of the District of Columbia. He owns like a third of New York State. I mean, the state. And then what happens? He goes bankrupt. And what do we do to people who go bankrupt? We put them in jail. So he ends up in Philadelphia at the 30th Street Jail. And that is when we started to rethink bankruptcy. George Washington risks yellow fever and goes to the 30th Street Jail to visit Robert Morris. And he looks at him, and the other founding fathers look at him, and they say, wait, this is a man who helped finance the revolution, and he's now in jail because he made some mistakes. This gave rise to the 1800 Bankruptcy Act. It's the first time we changed our idea of failure. Bruce Mann, a colleague at HLS, has a great book about this. That led to people saying, you know what, failure is not a moral failing. Failure is a bad outcome. That changed everything about bankruptcy. We now think about bankruptcy how? We protect the people who go bankrupt, not put them in jail. We protect them from the vicious creditors who are going after them. We prioritize giving them a quick start, a new start. We get them special help, we give them protection. That, I think, teaches us something about failure more generally, which is if you want to think about failure more generally, finance has a great way to think about failure, which is not moral failings, but actually a bad outcome, and maybe nothing more than that. I end with a little bit of an American Airlines story about their bankruptcy and a little bit of Greek tragedy. I'm going to end now because I really wanted to get to questions, and I've already gone 40 minutes. This last chapter is about why everyone hates finance. I can talk about that a little bit more later, but it tries to end with a story that's uplifting. Turns out there is a great story. Most of the stories about finance are terrible. It's like Wolf of Wall Street. Turns out there's one great story. It's Alexandra Bergson in O Pioneers. She's like a great financier. She does everything we do in the book. She leverages up, she diversifies, she merges, she manages risk with options. She does all those things, but she turns into this wonderful woman. And it's a fantastic story of finance leading to a good life, not leading to a bad life. All right, I've already gone on too long. You know, what's the basic idea? We should fix the gulf between finance and the humanities to demystify finance and to rehabilitate finance. And it turns out that the humanities, the best thing they do is they humanize things, unsurprisingly. They put moral content into situations, and that's what we need in finance. And it just turns out that the ideas and ideals of finance can actually help you live your life and hopefully can help fix finance. All right, fantastic. So I went a little bit late, but I have some questions here already. And if you want to have more, I'm happy to do that. So I've already got a couple on these cards. These aren't plants, I assure you. Can history tell us what the future of money will be? Is it Bitcoin or an alternative? So I'm just going to prove myself to be a cranky old man. I don't really believe in cryptocurrencies very much. I'm sorry for that. I think there are incredible things going on in technology. Blockchain is real, and it's like an incredible financial technology change. I personally, I'm a cranky old man. I don't believe those things. And I worry that it is, you know, a lot of people might get hurt in this process. I'm not an authority on it. I wouldn't take my version of it. That's not what this book is about, but that's my cranky old man reaction to this. Who was your favorite non-finance character in the book, or favorite story about finance that you haven't told us? That's a good story. That's a great question. Let's see, the favorite one that I didn't tell you about. God, that's a, you know, I'll tell you a story about options, if that's okay, because it's a fun story and it's actually a true story. So many of you will. This is a little bit of an odd choice, but I'll just try it out, because not all of this is like from 500 years ago. There's some contemporary things here. So Fred Smith is the guy who started FedEx, Federal Express, right? The logistics company. So it's the early days of FedEx. And he has a bill due on Monday morning for $30,000 to his suppliers. It's Friday afternoon. What does he do? He's got $10,000 in the bank. He's got $10,000 in the bank on Friday afternoon. It's the 1970s. He's got a $30,000 bill due on Monday. Things are really tough. What does he do? Any guesses to what he does? Sorry? It's Friday afternoon, pretty late, so borrowing is about done, and he's already kind of stretched very, very far. FedEx is on the brink of bankruptcy. Any ideas what he might do? He goes to Vegas. And he takes that $10,000 and he makes it into $40,000 and he pays off his suppliers, and FedEx goes on to live another day. In fact, many more days up until today. Okay, why is that an interesting story about options? The underlying story there, of course, is something that we know about options, which is Fred Smith and the owner of any bankrupt asset has a very nonlinear payoff. That's just a fancy way of saying they own an option. If things go well, Fred Smith gets to live on. If Fred Smith loses all the money at Vegas, he's no worse off than he was before he went to Vegas because he was going to go bankrupt anyway. That's an option-like payoff. In fact, being close to bankruptcy is an option-like status. What do you do when you own an option? Why are options so fantastic? Options are fantastic because they go up in value as volatility goes up. You hear your finance friends on Wall Street talk about vol, right? Vol is volatility. Turns out they're great for options. So Fred Smith owns an option. What should he do? He should jack up the volatility of his company. How do you jack up the volatility of your company? You go to Vegas. That's a way of trying to give an intuition for what options do and what they're meant to do. Not accumulate more options, but actually take big risks. There are lots of other stories, but I guess that was the one on the top of my head. So that's one. Oh, this is great. What skills do students need to maintain to stay competitive in today's job market? So I think that's a great question. I'll give you, again, my cranky old man answer to this. I find myself in this position more and more. You know, I really do believe in liberal arts. It's manifest in this book. I really believe in problem solving, and I really believe in writing. That's what I believe in. And so the notion that everybody should learn coding is not something that I've embraced. It smacks of the same reason we should have all learned Japanese 20 years ago, or 10 years ago we should all learn Mandarin. I'm not saying coding isn't great. I just don't quite get it. I would take, as the father of 3 daughters, I'd take an extra hour of math over an extra hour of coding. As I said, I'm a cranky old man. I believe in those underlying things, and I think if nothing else, those things are more important than ever. That's a way of saying I believe in the traditional recipes of liberal arts, and I believe in traditional problem solving. And that's what this book is a manifestation of in many ways. All right. Who is a current or historical financier you respect? That's a great question. You know, I'm hesitant to identify one person because I think it comes with its own baggage, but there are plenty of people who are, you know, doing things in finance that are spectacular. I happen to be looking straight at JP Morgan, so it's hard not to think about Jamie Dimon, who I think is a really interesting CEO who has weathered a lot of different things and done well. You know, I think there are a lot of people. You know, Warren Buffett is obviously somebody interesting. I think with all these stories, though, I'm not somebody to exalt anybody, really. There are always moral complexities to these people, and so I think that's true of Buffett as well. So I'm gonna just skirt that question, I think, because I believe there are a lot of great people in finance. I'm not terribly interested in naming them because I don't think that's my game. But this book is not meant to say there are bad people in finance. It's just meant to say we got some bad apples. I'll tell you the reason why I think we have so many bad apples and how you can protect yourself from becoming a bad apple. So the kind of in that last chapter, what I try to do is develop this theory. It's, you know, I almost regret this now, but it's called, if you'll pardon my language, it's called the a-hole theory of finance. Why do so many people who go into finance become jerks? I try to explain that why finance is really unique is because finance is a field, especially investing, where you get feedback very, very quickly. and it's inflated by leverage, and it looks really precise. So at the end of every day, you know what your book is. What do human beings do in that setting? Answer, they do something that every human being does. They make attribution errors. Everything good that happens is my doing. Everything bad that happens is the world's. If you talk to an investor, they talk about their successes. Their failures just go away in their mind. And in a way, they have to live their life. Those attribution errors happen at a scale and at a frequency and with a precision in finance that is nowhere else, I think, with the exception of maybe surgery. That gives rise to really hard balances to achieve in life. That gives rise to Martin Shkreli. That gives rise to bad behavior. The point of the book is to say, and the point of that Alexandra Bergson thing is to say, in order to protect yourself from that, you need a good story, because we all live our lives by stories. And I happen to think the O Pioneer story is a good story to live by, and it's certainly better than most of the finance stories you hear about. Let's see if I can read this one. Do you believe the returns, is due to over-regulation, which has an unintended consequences of limiting average investors' participation in growth of small companies? So I think this is about whether investors are being treated well in current markets. The reductions in stocks. Yeah. Yeah. So this is a great question. Let's just talk about why it's happened a little bit. One of the reasons it's happened is because of the share buyback story. There's been a retirement of a lot of shares. Part of the story is about mergers, and part of the story is about very low volumes. I think the buyback stuff is happening in a way that's quite pernicious and not terribly good. In fact, I think it's equivalent to kind of a slow motion LBO, of the country. Companies are getting levered up and buying back their shares all the time. Do individual investors have an in? Or do they have an advantage? And the answer is, on the one hand, the growth of indexation. What's the dominant trend of the last 10 years? It's the growth of indexation and ETFs. That has enabled a lot of investors to diversify and actually put their money to play in really smart, thoughtful, cheap ways. I think that's fantastic. What it has also given rise to is less real information in the market, because you have what is effectively large pools of dumb money. By dumb money, I don't mean something negative. I just mean they buy everything in the index. They don't think about what they're doing. You have large pools of dumb money who are out there moving markets all the time. That's terrible for individual investors, because markets aren't getting the information retrieval that they need. So, is this a good time to be an individual investor? Only if you think about individual investors, as I do, as primarily benefiting from diversification and really cheap ways to access the diversifying benefits of markets, as opposed to you think about individual investors as picking stocks. That's something which, unsurprisingly, I don't believe necessarily as much of. Oh, great. So this is a great question close to my heart. How can people become less intimidated and confused by money and finance? So the first thing to say about this, and by the way, this is totally something I believe, which is when people show up in my classroom, I think they're intimidated by finance. First question is, why are they intimidated by finance? And the answer, of course, is people in finance like to intimidate you. That's part of the game. And so you should understand that. You should understand that it's intimidating to you because somebody's trying to make it intimidating to you, not because it is per se intimidating. There are trappings of rocket science, but the reality, the intuitions are actually very straightforward. You may not know at the end of all this how to price a collateralized debt obligation. Answer is you don't need to. But you can get the core intuitions of finance very easily. How do you go about doing that? Unsurprisingly, the reason I wrote this book is for that purpose, is to get people into finance who wouldn't normally get there. So answer number one is, don't believe the hype, and understand that it's much more accessible than you think. Two, expose yourself to alternative ways to understand it, because pedagogically, the thing that makes the most sense is to look at a phenomenon from multiple angles. Don't just keep reading a textbook, because that's like looking at it from one angle. Come at it from many different angles. And then I think the final thing is to actually start to follow finance. Pick a company, start following them, listen to the investor calls, start to really get into what they're doing. And that is a fantastic way to learn. I think of as a ton of finance. All right, let's see. I'm 23 and trying to save up for law school. Should I still contribute to my 401k, and how much? My company matches up to 90%. Okay, 9%. I have very little to offer on this question. You know, in a way, I will just offer up this. That's not what this book is about. You know, I think, let me give you I'm going to give you two random thoughts. First, I will return to giving you some ideas about this, but I think the first thing I would say is I am shocked by how vacuous, like most personal finance books are. If anybody has a logic for why that is, I'd like to know, because they tend to be vacuous and they tend to be wrong. What should you be doing? You know, roughly speaking, answer is, at least my answer is, you should be investing in yourself if you're a young person. What does that mean? By and large, that means education. It can also just mean jobs that expose you to a lot of things. You should take your time in your 20s and 30s to just invest in yourself. The returns to your human capital are enormous. People who say college is a bad deal are wrong. I'm not just saying that because it's my business. On average, it's a good deal. We know that. Read the last economic report of the president under Obama. It's a good deal. Invest in yourself. That doesn't mean every educational decision is smart, you know, but it does mean on average it is. Second is save more than you think you should. On the margin, saving is always a good thing. We dramatically undersave. There's maybe 1% of the population who oversaves. The rest of us are undersaving dramatically. And start to learn how to do that very, very early in life. That is just dramatically important. In terms of specific tactics, always max out on anything that's tax effective. Try not to pay people too much money to manage your money. Those are like some basic things I would do. I don't have any particular purchase on this person's financial situation, though. Okay, great. One last one. How long will it take for everybody to realize that the role of capital is not just to make more money, but also to drive social and environmental change? I think that's a great question. I think that's already happening. I think if you look at a lot of sustainability indexes, a lot of practices, people are moving in this direction. And I think that will happen when society wants it to happen, when there's enough demand for those kinds of assets. You know, I personally don't agree with the premise of the question. The role of capital is not to make more money, you know, nor is it necessarily to drive change in one direction or the other. You know, it is to enable us to live the lives we want to live. And it's not necessarily a political force in the way that people think of it as, despite what many people say today. It is primarily a force where you can live a fuller life than you would have been able to live otherwise. That's the story of leverage. That's the story of a lot of things we talked about. You know, I believe deeply that we should drive a lot of different examples of social and environmental change. I think of that domain as being the political domain. And I think it's important to do it in the political domain. So that's my third cranky old man answer, you know, which is to say traditional mechanisms for addressing these problems are where we should be addressing them in the political arena. It is quite complicated when capital moves in a direction of multiple bottom lines. I know that's a very popular set of ideas today, but as I mentioned, I'm a cranky old man. All right, thank you very much.
Not cranky at all. Thank you for that. The Wisdom of Finance is on sale now. Thanks for coming.